Ah, summer. The birds are singing, the sun is bright, and the transfer window opens. And as ever, the inevitable call of the media soundbite echoes into our ears. And this season the media has once again excelled in laziness by recycling the call of last season, are Fulham doing a Fulham? Well, in this video, I, the Rubber Von Ducker, will investigate A. What are Fulham doing a Fulham? B. What is doing a Fulham? And C. Is doing a Fulham necessarily a bad tactic for a club coming from the Championship into the Premiership? So let's get started, and the first question is, are Fulham doing a Fulham? Yes, Fulham are doing a Fulham. If Fulham buy players, they're doing a Fulham. If they sell players, they're doing a Fulham. If they move the stadium and the team to Mars, well, you might argue they're doing a Musk, but really, they're doing a Fulham. So it's a bit of a silly phrase, especially if you're applying it to Fulham. I would argue a much better term for it would be the scattergun tactic. Obviously, if you're a Fulham fan and you're wed to that phrase because you feel it's historically belongs to your club, fine, keep calling it doing a Fulham. But I think the scattergun tactic is a much more accurate and sensible way to describe it. Obviously, it makes more sense if you're applying it to another club like Villa last season. But yeah, applying it to Fulham makes no sense. Now, the next question is, what is doing a Fulham? Well, I think we can all agree that it's seen as a Championship club coming up to the Premiership, spending a large amount of money on 10, 11, 12 players. That's effectively the core of the tactic. Now, there are two arguments that come from this that I experienced. One is it's unfair because you're spending a lot of money on these players, so the other clubs that have been promoted may not be able to compete. This is a rubbish argument simply because everyone gets the same money. So everyone's got the chance to do so. So holds no weight with me. The other major argument was by buying so many players and bringing them in and effectively replacing loyal players that have got you the promotion, you're undermining the morale in your squad. So those players who brought you up might not get to play and they're going to be upset about that and it's going to cause some dissent. The other side of it is that you've bought 12 players, many of them coming from different cities or different countries, and with that they'll have problems settling in. Some of them will have to learn a new language, some of them will have to get used to the new city or the new country or the new culture. There's also the fact they've got to get used to a new league with a Premier League, and it's a highly competitive league as we all know. And then there's getting used to the club and the people in the club. So there's quite a lot for a new player to digest when they arrive and adapt to. And that's why historically I think most managers would argue you don't get the performance you believe that the player can give until about 6 months into the season, which is December. And obviously if you're in difficulties in December, we all know if you're bottom of the Premiership in December, you're most likely to be relegated. Not always the case, but majority of times. So doing a Fulham is effectively not investing in a couple of players to improve the quality of your club, but buying in a lot of players so you haven't got a distinctive quality player, more of a squad growth. Now, the second argument holds more weight for me. Obviously, if this is a possibility whenever you bring in players, but bringing in a lot increases that risk. It does depend on the circumstances of the individual club. So obviously, if you've already got a lot of players, it's going to be more significant than if you've got a very small squad. Interestingly, though, that isn't really the definition of doing a Fulham. Whilst researching this, I found that the phrase comes from an interview with Mr. Sam Allardyce done on Sky Sports, talking about Villa's recruitment policy in the last transfer window. He was arguing that by doing the scattergun tactic, that you're not going to have the quality in the side to avoid relegation. And his preference would be to buy 3 or 4 higher quality players to give you a spine in the club that would hopefully help you beat relegation. It is interesting to note Mr. Sam Allardyce's previous clubs. Many of them you'll see in the Champageddon video. I'm not saying that necessarily he's responsible for the state they find themselves in. It may well be that the chairman has been free with the money to many managers. But it is interesting that the same names repeatedly appear in his career. The most recent one, I'd say, is Sunderland. Well, I think he left the year before they got relegated, and then they've now dropped down to League Two. Obviously, if that was his tactic then, that may be part of the issues that they're having with the finances, because obviously the 3 or 4 players he'd buy will be on considerably better wages than the ones who are coming in under the scattergun or doing a Fulham policy. But that isn't the point of this video, so I'm going to move away from that, and I think at this point it'd be wise to look at the individual cases to see if this tactic is valid, and that means we'll look at Fulham first, then Villa, and hopefully that will shed a bit further light on whether doing a Fulham, or the scattergun tactic as I like to call it, is an effective tactic for promotion and survival in the Premiership for Championship clubs. So this is the Wikipedia page for the 2018-19 Fulham season, the season they were promoted to the Premiership. A quick look here shows the transfers in that they had. A couple of expensive ones that we know about, some that were cheap. I don't think that's a massive input of players particularly. It's a big input, but I've seen bigger. This is their loans in as well, so that improves the numbers a bit more. And here are their transfers out. Now, the notable thing about their transfers out, only Ryan Fredericks stands out as a player who could have played Premier League level for them. He moved to West Ham on a free because he was out of contract, so I don't know why they didn't re-sign him, whether it was too expensive or they felt there was other opportunities. Some other players of note left, like David Button, who went to Brighton Hove and Albion, and Stephen Humphreys, who left the club in the January transfer window. And so when you look at the players that did play, we're going to scroll down. Here we go. You can see that there was quite a few players who got games. No defender didn't get a single game. The same with midfielders. So there were plenty of people who got to play. Many of them, like Tim Ream, Cyrus Christie, they'd played in the championship team that got them up. So the argument that the players that were loyal and got you up didn't play isn't real. They played. So what effectively Fulham did was expand the squad and create competition for places. Unfortunately, it didn't pay off. They didn't stay up. However, they then went into the championship, and now they're back up a year later. So the benefit to their squad didn't keep them up, but it got them back there very quickly. So I think in the larger sense, it was a successful tactic for Fulham on the pitch. Off the pitch, I would argue it's an even better tactic. We see here their transfers in for their season in the Championship. Some interesting names. So they expanded their squad when they went down. They also loaned out players. So here we've got 2 that were in the first team they actually brought in for the Premiership. They send them out on loan so they could advertise themselves at the clubs, and if need be they can sell them. Obviously, if they've got clauses in their contracts that keeps them at the club, if they can buy them out, then Fulham just get the money. But if they're not bought out, they'll return to the squad and you can choose whether to use them or not. So getting players back on loan adds to the choices that the manager has. Transfers out, you can see the transfers out were considerably more, obviously due to a lot of loan players returning there. A lot of players released. Don't know whether that was due to age or due to them not achieving the level they want for a youth player. But they let a lot more people go in their return to the Championship. They did have a couple of big players leave. Ryan Sessegnon went for about 25 to 30 million. Harvey Elliott, I'm not sure how much he went for, but I'm presuming it's 10 million plus. Other players being sold as well. So they've had a bigger clear out this season, or I should say last season, coming into this season. And now they're in a position where they can use those players back on loan, use the players that they've refined into a squad in the Championship, as well as adding to those players if they feel the need to. So not only have they returned straight back to the Premiership, they've also got a certain amount of flexibility in their budget. They've got flexibility in their squad to some degree, and they're in a much better position than they were in the 2018-19 season. It's going to be interesting to see what they do. Whether they buy, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't buy 4 or 5 players. I just don't see them buying as many players as last time. But I would argue for Fulham, that has been a successful tactic. It might not have been as successful as they hoped. It didn't keep them up. But equally, it hasn't ruined them as a club, and they've got straight back up. So they can't be too sad about that. Now on to Villa. Now I'm at the Aston Villa 2019-20 season. I won't bore you with the details of previous seasons because I don't really want to look at it. They weren't great seasons. So we'll look first at the players going out. And here you can see the majority of our problem last season. A lot of these players who were first team players like Albert Stoma, Richie Delat, Tommy Elphick, they were all left because they were at the end of their contracts. So their contracts had ended. Yes, we could have negotiated a new contract, but most of these players weren't going to be first team players in the Premiership, so they'd be squad players. That's not necessarily going to make them happy. Also, there's a question of what kind of wages would we have to pay them. So yep, we had to let them go. Most of them were getting to the point where they've got a season, 2 or 3 seasons left in them for their career. We did have Gary Gardner go for money, but he's a player who never really got a chance in the squad, which is a bit of a shame. I think that was probably the best move for him, to go to Birmingham. We do have Mika Richards down here, who is a symbol for one of those players we signed in the Premiership. Due to injury, his career floundered at Villa. We bought him on a free transfer, so he got, I would presume, very good wages. And unfortunately, that was probably the reason why we couldn't get him to move on to any other club. He's finally reached the end of his contract in this season, so that helped reduce our wage bill. But as you can see, there's not many players that immediately scream Premiership quality. But as you can see from our purchases in, not many large ones. Tyrone Mings, 20 million, who I thought that was a bit too much for him. I thought 15 would have been reasonable. Obviously now, though, I think Bournemouth fans would probably be saying we sold him too cheap, and they're probably correct because he's been outstanding for us. Most of the players we brought in have been. Wesley, again, another large value player coming in. Got injured on January the 1st, so his season was effectively cut in half. Gave us 6 goals. Looked like he was beginning to have, well, it looks like he'd settled and begun to understand the team's movement. Unfortunately, like I say, he served half a season. If he'd done as many goals in the second half as the first, we'd be saying it would be a real success because it would be 12 goals. That's quite a reasonable return on a first season. Hoping we'll see a better season from him this season, but we'll have to wait and see. You've got players like Trezeguet. Cost us just under 9 million. How much is he worth? He was a second high scorer for us this season. Could be worth as much as 15 to 20 million. More than double that money. Douglas Luiz, same thing. 15 million. There's a 25 million pound buyout clause for Manchester City. If they activate that, we've made 10 million. If they don't, then I'd expect to get more than that, because obviously they inserted that buyback clause into his contract. Mr. Heaton, good purchase for 8 million. Again, unfortunately injured halfway through the season. But if in the future we look to sell him, if we were relegated, we could sell him, and I dare say we'd get more than 8 million for him if we were relegated. So a lot of these players, yes, they were relatively cheap, but I think they've increased their value, a number of them. Maybe not Jota, maybe not Courtney House, although Courtney House is relatively cheap at 3 million, so he may have been worth that before we even bought him. But yeah, by buying this many players, we just need 2 or 3 players to be worth 30-40 million pounds, and it's paying its way. So Mings would be an obvious case that may be sold. You can make an argument for Trezeguet and Douglas Luiz. If we sell those 3, we could be looking at 90, even 100 million, which pays off most of a transfer window, which means we've revitalised our squad for effectively nothing. And again, we stayed up, so successful on both counts. If we had gone down, though, the wages are less, I presume, for these players than they would be for other Premiership players, and we could play them in the Championship. Or equally, we could loan them out to European clubs, put them in the window, get them sold, bring money in, buy new players. All of this is obviously dependent on you having a decent scouting system, which Villa suddenly seem to have achieved. So for me, this is a successful tactic, both for Fulham and for Villa. I think it's kind of hard to argue against. Now, how we do in the next season is going to be interesting. I expect it to be a very competitive season for all teams. If you finished halfway up the table this season, you could be fighting for relegation, because I think with the financial issues with COVID and other issues as well, it may be a more competitive league than usual. I don't think Villa are particularly safe. I don't think Crystal Palace are particularly safe. I'm not even sure I'd say Everton are particularly safe, although one would presume they would be. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see who does use a scattergun tactic next. I would have thought Leeds this season might be the most obvious candidate rather than Fulham. But we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, from a financial viewpoint, I think this is a very good tactic, because even in the worst case scenario, you're covered. Whereas if you've bought those 3 or 4 expensive players that Sam Allardyce suggested, you have the risk of 2 or 3 of them being less than beneficial, and then they're stuck on your books. This way, if you've got players who are stuck on your books, it's not going to hurt you as much. And I guess that's a lesson that we learned from the Championship. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope you all enjoyed that and have a very good remainder to your week at whichever point you see this. And I hope you're staying well. Take care.